Hey everyone, and welcome to the Onion Layers episode. This is a topic I like to talk about often because I think it's a helpful metaphor, and I'm someone who really likes to relate things to images or analogies or metaphors, etc., just because illuminate what I'm talking about or give a different way of interacting with the concept that might be easier to grasp. So when we think of an onion, there's layers to it, hence the the name of this episode. So there's layers and layers and layers, and you peel them back and eventually you get to this central space in the onion. And what I think of in terms of that central space, that core, not that there's like a pit or anything to an onion, but that innermost layer is who we are. That is our essence, our authentic self, if you will. And maybe another way to think of it is it's the person we came into the world being. When we are born, if we were able to speak and think as we can as adults, we would have this really intuitive capacity to communicate who we are, to show up in this really authentic way that is just completely resonant with the personality we come into the world having. We often talk about nurture versus nature. And so nature is that core self that we are when we come into this world. And when that core self then comes into contact with, say, an abusive parent or a bully at school or a stressful event or some belief system that is in their world often enough that it becomes adopted. Or we can think of these things as layers that start to get put on this core self, this core person. So these are the layers of the onion that begin to get packed on. And whatever is the outermost layer, the most exposed layer, that is the persona, the person that we show up as in the world. So that's the outward facing self, the self we identify with, who we show up as, what people think of when they interact with us. And that's not to say that people don't get glimpses of our essence, nor does it say that there's no aspect of us that is sort of authentic. It's not saying that there's no authentic self showing up in the world, but there's these layers that alter our authentic self. It's like if you put food coloring into water, the water's still there. The essence of the water is still there, but it looks different. It's got a different color. It probably tastes a little different than if the water was just water. So that's the way to think about these layers, is that it's not like we're this completely different human, but there are ways that that authentic self is being filtered and expressed differently. And of course, it's also true to say that the more layers there are, the less and less and less in tune we are with that authentic self. And yes, the less that part of us comes through. So an example of this might be someone who is a people pleaser. So let's say you grew up in a world where pleasing people was a way to survive. If you made such and such person happy, that meant they would not get mad and maybe they wouldn't hurt you. So my job, my role is to make people happy. And when I do that, harm is less to the people I love, to myself, etc. And so then that people pleasing persona, that layer, takes away from the part of you that really wants to say no to something or set a boundary, or that doesn't actually like that person and doesn't really want to interact with them. Those natural urges and emotions and inclinations that you might have, ways you might otherwise show up in the world, are changed because of that layer. And so that is a way in which the natural tendencies, that core self, does not get to show up authentically. And the more we engage in these behaviors, the more rooted and more solidified they become. They become something we identify with really strongly, to the point where if we were to take that layer away, it feels unsafe. Because first of all, it's what we're used to. And when we get used to something, it's familiar, and familiarity is safe. We can expect it. We can rely on it. We know what it's all about. There's a lot of fear around the unknown, and we'll talk about this on other episodes, but it's one of those things where the irony, if that's the right word, is even if we know it's harmful for us, it's safer. It feels safer to our system to do the thing that's harmful versus to do something new, because something new is unknown. We don't know what to expect. We don't know what it's about. And that just feels way scarier. So it's easier to keep that layer on than to take it off. And so this is the conundrum we find ourselves in, where we see the harm in the layer and yet it feels safe to keep it there. And these like safety walls that are keeping us from engaging with that core self. So when we go on a healing journey, we are essentially working through these layers because chronic illness or illness in general, symptoms are a way that our body is expressing a misalignment with our authenticity. So whenever you're saying yes when you mean no, when you are showing up for something you didn't want to show up for, when you're smiling when you want to cry, when you are wanting to set a boundary but feel like you have to do something, when you're in a job that is soul crushing, when you're in a relationship that is not reflecting back your worth, all of those things are this continuous way in which we are showing up and engaging in things that are not in alignment. They're not resonating with our core authentic self. And so that causes a stress response in the body, which causes our body to shift into a mode that does not promote health and healing. And again, these are topics that will be talked about in other episodes. But the more we engage in these things that cause stress, the more we are in that mode that does not promote healing, and that leads to illness. So illness is this way to start to get back into that core self. So the symptom is a guiding post. And this is part of the work that we do in my community space and through the courses that I teach, is reframing our idea around what illness really is. That illness really helps us to find these layers, find what stands between our authentic self and our current outward facing self, and start to peel those layers back and facing the fear that comes up around that, facing the emotions that might be packed into that layer, facing the limiting belief that that layer might have, like, you're not worthy enough, you're not lovable, you're bad, you're stupid, whatever it is. We have to work through these layers in order to release them, in order to get to the next layer or to get into a closer and closer proximity to that core self. One of the things I do believe is that we can get back to that core self. However, I do believe we are also always adding layers on. Like we might come into contact with a situation that feels stressful or uncomfortable, or let's say we express a sense of humor and someone pushes back against it. And we might say, oh, I guess my sense of humor is inappropriate. I guess maybe I should hide that part of myself. But if we start to do this work, we can start to catch when we are putting a layer on and do the work to track back, to take that layer back off again and say, you know what, if that person doesn't like my sense of humor, that's okay. That doesn't mean that it's not okay for me to express that. Maybe I won't around them, or maybe that person's not for me, but it doesn't mean that I have to just blanket hide that part of myself anymore, because that's who I am. And the more we get back to that core and we get that sense of this is who I am, we start to be really familiar with and be able to easily identify this is something that is causing me to go away from my authentic self. And so I'm going to see this as a kind of a test to keep me in my integrity. It's challenging my self-worth because it wants to keep me making high self-worth decisions. And so I'm going to stay in my integrity by saying no, or, not interacting with that person, or whatever the response is that ultimately keeps us in integrity with ourselves. Well, again, this is an analogy I use often in the healing journey, and those layers are really tough to peel back, especially if we are not familiar with the fact that it's normal and totally expected to encounter these things in the healing journey. There's many, many layers where we will feel like the healthiest and best decision is to go back to what's familiar. And so there's always a choice point when we encounter this next layer. Are we going to move forward through it, seeing it for what it is? Or are we going to go back to old behavior because that's what's safe and familiar? And so it's always that choice point. I think one of the underlying themes of this work is that challenges or things that are uncomfortable, things that are triggering, etc., can either be thought of as bad and something to be avoided, or they can be thought of as places where we grow. We grow outside of our comfort zone. So that leads us to anything that is uncomfortable is going to lead to growth. So I hope this was helpful. And if you found this interesting, I would highly recommend you consider joining the Sacred Illness community, where you get access to archives of videos such as this one and much more. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.